The point is, though, to catch them quickly and stop talking about dwell time and it's 100 and something, 180 days, or it's 7 months or whatever it might be. Like, we get that, but frankly, it's hyperbole. Like, the point is, these guys do their damage in minutes, maybe hours.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an Iron Scales podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IronScales, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Today I'm joined by Mark Sangster, cybersecurity author and expert, award-winning speaker, evangelist, and industry security strategist at eSentire. Mark has also released his own book called The Inside Truth About Cybercrime and How to Protect Your Business. Hey Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brendan. Always a pleasure. We've worked a few times before in the past and looking forward to working together today.
Thanks. I'm happy to have you back, and I'm excited about our discussion today on managed detection and response. But before we begin, I'd love for you to share a bit about your background and what you're working on these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So over, too many decades now of working in IT and security, I've worked with, some of the big names like the Cisco's, Intel, BlackBerries, and so on of the world. But for the last 10 years, I've been with eSentire, which is a managed detection and response company, which we're going to get into. And my focus within the business is really looking at managing business risk, right? So working with executives, working with companies in different industries to, identify what the specific challenges are or threats that they face, and then coming up with, solutions that mitigate not only like the cyber risks, but the knock-on effects, right? So whether that's like making insurance claims or litigation or, things like that.
I would love to open the show with your book, No Safe Harbor. What inspired that? And if you can give a quick synopsis before we dive into the show.
Yeah, for sure. So, No Safe Harbor is kind of the culmination of, I'd actually say about the last 10, 15 years of work. And, often what I find the most effective ways of communicating with companies is, to tell the stories, right? And often it's all those stories that don't make the headlines because, they read about the big Fortune 500 companies, right? And these massive ransomware outages at utilities as an example. And it kind of creates this false sense of security because these smaller businesses say, oh, well, I'm not a bank or I'm not a, water supply or oil and gas or whatever it is. So, nobody's coming after me. And the reality is they do suffer the lion's share of cyber attacks. And you look at insurance claims and, there's lots of data to sort of back that up. So I wanted to tell those stories, not to like blame these companies, right? But to sort of expose the fact that, you are actually the primary target of cyber criminals and, and here's what went wrong, right? And here's what we can do to fix it. And, sort of say like over and over, I see the same thing happen again and again. And they always have common factors. So I wanted to, reverse engineer those as a way of helping companies with a simple kind of framework protect their business.
Awesome. So for those who may not be familiar, can you give us a quick simplified version of what an MDR is?
Yeah, absolutely. So MDR is managed detection and response. And, to some degree, it's a bit of a fragmented piece that came off of MSSPs that we're all more familiar with, right? Like, again, managed security service providers. And it was about, I'd say 6 years ago now that Gartner actually coined the term. And the idea here is that it's a bit of a shift from managing all the devices to focusing on threats. So in a simple sort of terminology or the 50,000 foot view, it's effectively a turnkey security as a service or SOC as a service, right? So 24/7, someone is monitoring whatever aspects of your environment through SOC, through SOC analysts when they detect something, they then, effectively respond. So whatever that means, right, is that, investigating, containing, alerting, and so on. And that's, that's kind of where I think the waters get a little more muddied.
So how does it differ from the traditional MSSP model?
Yeah. So if I look at sort of maturity of security over time, right, way back in the day, right, decades ago, we had what I would have called point security, right? You had viruses, so we got antivirus. You got spam, so we got anti-spam, and so on, right? And all those things just kept, stacking up until we had this mountain of stuff, in our corporate backyard. And then MSSPs developed as a way of kind of managing them, aggregating them, look, we'll take care of your firewall. We're an expert. We can deal with your antivirus and keep it up to date and so on. And then, that kind of rolled over into reporting, right? So, well, what is all this stuff doing for me? And all that's kind of device focused, right? It's I'm managing the devices. I'm keeping them patched. I'm pulling nice, pretty monthly reports to tell you that everything's good. But yet we see companies time and time again continually getting hacked and exposed. And that's where MDR kind of came in to say, you know what? I'm less worried about how your firewall's configured, and I'm more worried about catching whatever got through your firewall, right? So, we deal with, I think it's 20 billion different signals a year, and on average, it's a couple of billion per client, per month, I should say. And, all of that information, all that data, all those alerts or indicators of compromise all got to us after they went through firewalls and antivirus and all those other tools, right? So, our focus is really less about what's going on in your perimeter, making sure the doors and windows are locked. MDR is more about we're sitting in the vault and we're waiting for the bad guy to get to the vault to, steal the money. And when they open, when they pick the lock and they get in, we're right there and we can stop them before they can get away and steal those funds or steal that data.
Before we go any further, I'd like to quickly address the elephant in the room. So what steps are MDR vendors like yourself doing to protect your customers from similar supply chain ransomware attacks like we saw over the July 4th weekend with Cassia?
So that's a great question. Now, in fact, if we go back a couple of years, back to 2018, we actually detected with our clients another compromise through that vendor. And in that case, at source, criminals had embedded crypto mining software. So, okay, it's a little more innocuous, right? At the end of the day, they're stealing some, electricity and compute power, and it's not quite as bad as, deploying ransomware or something else, right? Or stealing data. But it had that ability. And when we detected that, we went back upstream. We worked out who it was. And as I said, it was, we realized it was coming from Kaseya at source, and we worked with them, and they were very diligent over sort of a 2-week period to, determine what was going on, patch, and so on. And we actually went through several iterations. So typically we're monitoring outside of those vendors, and we're looking for all sorts of different indicators of compromise that come from multiple sources, like endpoints, network, cloud-based services, IoT devices. And we're doing that not just with sort of, IOCs and known patterns and signatures, but we're looking at sort of aberrant or anomalous behavior. And that's where we tend to detect it. So for example, that's a relatively easy catch because we can see, okay, wait a minute, there's traffic going in the wrong direction. Or, this is what the average traffic from this vendor looks like. And now we're seeing spikes in the middle of the night. That might be odd. And it was the same thing with the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities, the Hafnium attacks that we saw a couple of months ago. Same thing, right? So we saw, odd scripts appearing on people's Microsoft Exchange servers, and we're like, hang on, did you guys put that there? And of course they would say, work it out. We realized no, the answer is they did not. And then, we would help them remediate. So we're kind of the eyes in the sky, right? We're above all the battlefield. And so not only we dealing with the triage side of it down on the ground, but we're also looking at those broader patterns. And of course, when we see it in one client, we then, pivot to protect all those clients and put out alerts and notifications. And in the cases where we didn't discover it, but it comes out after the fact, then like SolarWinds would be a good example. Then we work with those clients to mitigate. But even if I back up, not go too far here, we also do a lot of risk management work. So as part of our risk assessments, we actually have a whole track and professional services group that actually looks at vendor risk. So, assessing the vendor, why you're using them, what data passes to them, how it's stored, and then helping them actually even write contracts down to, what kind of insurance should they carry, or, who does what in the event of these types of events, right? Who's going to notify your clients or pay for, to make them whole or do the investigation and those kind of things, right? We help them look at the sort of the 360 perspective and understand what benefits, but also what risks those vendors might bring.
How do you see future relationships with the MSSP market, for example? How do you see those relationships changing with their customers? Do you think the customers are going to push back harder when assigning terms and going over compliance in the contract? Like, how do you see this changing things?
That's a great point, and I think that is where companies have to do this. And it's a year or so ago now, so it's a little out of date. I conducted some primary research with about 650 executives across different firms, across all sorts of different industries, to look at supply chain risk. And what I actually uncovered was about half of them had suffered what they considered a material breach. Right now, I didn't define material; they did. So, what that means, I don't know, right? Could be a bit of apples and oranges here and bananas. But what we also found was that while I think it was about 80-something% of them actually said, yes, supply chain risk is important to them, only about 30-something had actually provisioned resources to manage them, right? And it shows that kind of gap. And I think the risks with vendors now and where companies have to sort of change their perspective is you bring in that vendor and there's a sort of a baseline or lowest water level of trust, right? And you assume they're doing their jobs. And in many cases, particularly with larger vendors, companies go, well, they got more resources than us. They have more money than us. They must be better at security than we are. And that may be true. That might not be true, right? And even if they're really good at security, it doesn't mean something can't happen to them, right? And we've seen that time and time again. So it is more about, I think, creating what I would consider a realistic relationship, which says, yeah, I do trust you as a vendor. However, here's where we see the risks. We would like to see some minimum requirements in place as far as security standards. Here's perhaps the bar that we have to hold ourselves to because, let's say we work with healthcare patient records or financial regulated information and so on. So we have to meet these standards. So now you have to meet these standards. And of course, contractually, and that comes down to what happens if you don't, what happens if there's an event, how do you notify us, how much insurance do you carry so that, there's some assurance here or indemnification when these things happen. So I think the short answer for you here is you can't just go, yep, looks great and sign the contract. And frankly, that's what we see 90% of the time is that the lawyers have signed the contract and the ink is drying. They throw it over the fence to the IT team and the IT team's like, well, we didn't know about this. And now I have to figure out how to integrate it into our environment. And it's a rock and a hard place situation because they're on the hook to deploy because obviously the company deems it critical to their business operations. But at the flip side, they're the ones who are going to be held accountable when it goes wrong. And, there is a breach because of that vendor.
To your point, I think I heard over the weekend that Biden is going to be getting involved with the FBI in an investigation around this. So do you foresee compliance starting to trickle down into the MSSP and MDR business in the near future?
Yeah, so like GRC, like governance, risk, and compliance has certainly been an element, and I think that will become more prevalent, right? So, again, like we work with a lot of, healthcare institutions and financial institutions and government vendors and things like that, and they have specific standards they have to meet. But what I would say, and while there are groups like the public arm of Homeland Security does provide guidance, the problem is it's not in the right language, right? And I think this is where, while I commend the administration for saying, look, we got to step in, we got to look at this more closely, this is a real problem. The flip is, providing sort of plain language, non-technical, basic requirements. And, I'd love to start to see something like a bit like the physical compliance that we have for, appliances, you know what I mean? So like you have, Underwriter's Laboratory and, don't stick a utensil in a toaster that's plugged in and on, those kind of things. We worry about electrical hazards and explosions if, you've got a chemical in an aerosol can. And now we need to deal with the virtual cyber versions of those to kind of say, look, here's the baseline. As an organization, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Right. And if you now deal with healthcare records, you got to take it up a level. And if you deal with, secret, highly confidential information, you got to take that up another level. And I actually think that it's not just a government problem. Frankly, I think where I could see some real stepping in here is insurance companies who could start to say, you know what, you have to do these minimums, these 5 minimum things. And if you're not doing them, I'm either not insuring you or your premiums are outrageous. Just like, imagine your driving record or your health, right? If, you're a smoker and you've got heart problems, you got all these issues, what you pay for coverage is going to be a lot higher higher than a physically fit, healthy individual with no, pre-existing medical conditions. Same kind of concept. I think we need to start setting that bar because there's just too many companies out there who, I say they use ignorance as bliss, and ignorance is not. It's negligence, right? It's potentially negligence. And, I think the damages that those companies face is limited by the creativity of the plaintiffs, that they go against in a courtroom.
I think that's like a whole nother episode, just going into
absolutely
going into insurance loopholes. So, I'd love to kind of go through the journey that you've had, since you've been at eSentire. I know you've been there for some time, so I would love to kind of hear, what propelled the MDR market to where it is today.
Yeah, so that's a really great sort of question, right? And it's a great observation to make because 10 years ago or so, a lot of companies didn't see threats. The companies that were more active in cybersecurity were ones that, as I said, were regulated, like when the SEC came out around cybersecurity risk and kind of put together, I think it was 21 sections or points that their governed entities had to adhere to, right? And healthcare, of course, through HIPAA, but that was all about privacy and compliance, right? It really wasn't about security. It was that notion of a medical person accidentally exposes records. They leave their laptop somewhere unlocked or they copy documents that they shouldn't copy, right? It wasn't about outsiders who would maliciously, get in that environment, steal that information for whatever criminal purpose, right? So that's a big shift that I've seen is moving from that kind of, compliance as, mom and dad telling you need to clean up your room to more of a sort of an intrinsic view of this is what we need to do to protect our business. So I see that big shift. And I think over the last 5 years, the cyber risks or the cyber threats, I should say, have become far more sophisticated, right? Like ransomware is a good example here. It's no longer what I called opportunistic transactional, right? You get the phishing email. It looks like it comes from a streaming service, says your credit card doesn't work anymore. Click the link to put in a new card. And it doesn't matter if they get a law firm, a bank, or, grandma, they were looking for, say, $500 in cryptocurrency. Now it's targeted. They're looking at massive outages because they want those 7-figure payoffs, the ones, unfortunately, we've been reading about in the headlines. So that sophistication has changed. And I think there's been pushback on the security industry because we've had firewalls and antivirus and anti-spam and all this next generation stuff keeps coming out. But the reality is companies still keep getting hit, right? So it's almost like the worst quadrant to be in, right? I'm paying a lot of money for security and I'm being exposed or exploited by these cyber attacks, right? It is the worst place to be. At least if you weren't spending money on defenses, you wouldn't be sort of, it wouldn't be sort of insult to injury. And that's where I think there's been a significant pushback on the security industry to say, like, guys, you keep selling me this stuff. You tell me it's perfect. It's not perfect. And that's where, our focus has been, I'm not going to tell you that you're not going to get hacked. I'm not going to tell you that somebody won't get into your environment. The point is, though, to catch them quickly and stop talking about dwell time and it's 180 days or it's 7 months or whatever it might be. Like, we get that, but frankly, it's hyperbole. Like, the point is these guys do their damage in minutes, maybe hours. So, you got to catch the stuff fast. And if you do, it's like cleaning up spilled milk, right? It's like, oh, they got in, they tried to deploy a payload, malware as an example, and we detected that, we've stopped it. So ransomware doesn't become a major issue. And doing that simplifies it. If you don't, and they are in your environment for months, and I think that's where a lot of the security models fail, because they assume that, if my perimeter is really strong, they can't get through. Well, that's just nonsense, right? They come in wearing the employee's badge 90% of the time, and use your own tools against you, like we're talking about the attacks over the weekend. Then, it's a failing model, right? And it metastasizes, and then that's when you get these massive, outages, right? That's where they've deployed ransomware or they've disabled backups and they've downdrafted next-gen antivirus and done all these things. And, that's the real problem, right? So we have to shift the mentality of they're inside the wire. They're going to get inside the perimeter. So I think the next step is going to be, worrying less about facilities and even virtual ones and more about what matters. Well, it's the assets and it's those people who have access to those assets, right? So forget the windows and locks and the security guard at the bank. Let's worry about the cash in the vault and the tellers who have the combination to the vault, and are the authorized individuals to go in and take that money.
Having helped my company at IronScales create the email security category known as mailbox level or API category, also referred to now as IESS by Gartner, I'd love to hear your category journey of MDR. I know you touched on it a bit, but what do you see as the next evolution of MDR?
Yeah, so MDR in one sort of axis has advanced from, one of the challenges we had. We started in the financial industry. We worked with a lot of companies that people I'd never heard of, right? Not the big banks, but hedge funds and institutional investors and family funds and trust funds and all those kind of things, right? Lots of money, not a lot of employees, right? And so not a lot of, frankly, wherewithal to be able to protect themselves, right? They had big company problems, but they were a little company. We sort of started off and we focused on their network, and we had to build our own tools to, capture flow and be able to look at not just headers, but full packets and reverse engineer what was going on and kind of near real time, you know what I mean? Be able to grab, say, what do we think is suspicious? Oh, that's some HTML traffic. What did they download? Well, here's a binary. Let's go detonate that binary in a sandbox and see if it's actually bad. And all the time trying to defend the client. So we built a bunch of proprietary tools. And then over time, it expanded with, endpoint and cloud and IoT. And it'll kind of continue doing that. And I think that was one of the big challenges we had in a different perspective was that's what we were doing. But how did the industry see you and what box did they put you in, right? Or what pigeonhole? And it was managed security service provider. And we tried all sorts of things. We talked about MSSP 2.0, that's going to be about threat management, not device management. And then we tried the doomed and failed ATP, which was, I think, advanced threat protection, right? Which of course just sounds like, APT. So, that wasn't going to cause confusion. And, and then you spent the whole time educating. Well, what is that? Right. And now you're trying to explain what an advanced persistent threat is. And then companies are like, oh, look, that government's not coming after us. They're not using Stuxnet or whatever. Like, get over it. You're just selling fear here. Right. And it took a lot of pushing with analyst firms like Gartner. And, one of the challenges we had was, companies like that would say, hey, fill out our survey because we want to include you in our report. And then when I went down through the survey, I'd be like, well, we don't qualify here. We don't do that. You know what I mean? It's like, we can't meet your standards because we have to have whatever it was, thousands of devices under management and so many firewalls. And so many were like, well, we don't do that. Right. And eventually that's where working in collaboration with those organizations, that's what they kind of said, you know what? There is a different category emerging here. And, I think the good news is that first report had, I think, 14 vendors in it. Well, now it has 100 and something in it. And I put them in a couple of categories. There's the true MDR players who are really doing that. And then there's the ones that are kind of trying to pivot from what they are. Do you know what I mean? So they're adopting new technology. They're trying to, evolve or adapt their services. And then there's the ones that frankly used to have a green bow on their packaging and now have put a blue bow on their marketing packaging. And they call it MDR because they know that gets them good search results. Right. It's a good news, bad news thing, right? Because the good news is you're seeing, the more companies migrate to this approach, it's validation of this type of service and strategy. That said, then you've also got a lot of noise and a lot of confusion in the market, and everybody's selling saying they sell the same thing, and that's a little bit of let the buyer beware because they're not all the same.
Yeah, and I know we're going to specifically cover this framework around the MDR model, so no spoilers for the next few minutes before I just cover off a few more questions. How far do you think the category still needs to go before it becomes kind of solidified like MSSPs are?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I think you're hitting on one of the biggest challenges in the market, which is it is still considered to be, I believe, a market category. So if we take like Gartner as an example, there isn't a magic quadrant. And now what I would say, though, is when those analysts' clients call in and say, look, here's what I'm trying to do, here's the problems I have, or whatever it is, they are now recommending MDR. But I do think that there's still a ways to go here, right? Which is, it's a bit like, accretion, right? We say, oh, you need a network. You need to be able to look at the network in real time. Well, now you need to deal with endpoint. Now you need to deal with cloud, right? So we're adding these things on. And frankly, I think we need to stop worrying about what you're adding on and start worrying about what the outcomes are. So, what is MDR about? Well, I'd say in short term, right? It's about the ability to rapidly detect a threat in your environment, right? And be able to investigate it and contain it before it becomes business disrupting. Again, I'm talking outcomes here, right? I'm talking about, I don't want the massive ransomware outage. I don't want a whole, gigabytes or terabytes of data stolen that, expose our company to all sorts of, litigation, right? Those are the kind of things that I want to see prevented. And I think this focus at the front end, which is like network and endpoint and cloud and IoT and whatever comes next, they're all important, but they're just the signal, you know what I mean? They're the way of collecting the information. The real art and the real capability is in the ability to respond. And your response, effectively, I think your success measure of your response needs to be, well, was our company hacked, right? Did it lead to a massive incident? Did we have to call in PR and notify a regulator? And that's the kind of stuff, if you're staying out of that bad end of the spectrum, you're doing a good job, right? And so I do think tighter definitions need to be in play. And I do think that, they do need to look at what I'd call the sort of the chimeras, right? We do this one core piece. We do cloud security as an example, but we also manage it. So, we're MDR, and it's like, well, you're MDR for cloud, but, bad guys island hop. So what happens if they come in through an endpoint? What happens if they come in through an IoT enabled device, right? Are you going to catch that? Or is it going to be at the point where they've now been in your cloud for too long and now, again, you have an exposure that you didn't want. So I think that's where you kind of got to, tighten the definition. Like it's too nebulous right now, and they need to tighten it up. And while I'm not a fan of pigeonholes, the reality is people put them in their budgets, right? I have so much for SIM. I have so much for next-gen antivirus, right? And so on down the line. So that is unfortunately how business works. So we need a point where everyone goes, when I say to you, hey, Brendan, what's MDR? And I ask, another colleague, what's MDR? We generally have an agreement, right, on what we mean when we're using that term.
Cybersecurity Heroes is brought to you by IronScales, an AI-powered, self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
Yeah, some questions kind of popped into my head while we were talking. So you talk about security being expensive. We hear a lot about complexity with all the shiny tools and shiny tool syndrome. Would you say that one of the advantages of working with an MDR is that you could potentially offload some of those questions or decisions of what do I need, how many tools do I need? Like if you can have one throat to choke, does that make things simpler, or is it more of a hybrid? It's not a one-size-fits-all relationship with MDRs.
Yeah, I would sort of answer that in 2 parts. So I'll do the easy bit first, which is, there isn't quite a one-size-fits-all. So I would say you need to look at what your requirements are. Like we're really good at detection, or we have these tools, but we don't know how to respond, or we don't have the resources to respond. So I really need a company that can do that, like I said, near real-time investigation and containment piece for me. That's just a simple example. Now, on the sort of the other side of, I think, MDR, that's where, there is certainly a bigger conversation, right, about sort of accountability and responsibility. And I do think, I wouldn't quite call it one throat to choke, but there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship here, right? So what we see, for example, is as we protect our clients, we not only are dealing with like the tactical, what are we stopping today, but we're also kind of gaining sort of trend intelligence to be able to say, if you were to say use multi-factor authentication, because you're not, you would have eliminated all of these attacks, right? Or if you were to invest in this technology. So Does it eliminate firewalls and antivirus and all those things? Absolutely not. Not at all, right? I mean, I think there are fundamentals you have to have in place. That said, we can optimize them. You can reduce cost, right? Because, you're realizing, okay, if I tune this thing better, we're in better shape here. Your IT team is not, they're kind of focused, and we certainly do a lot of that work. So, like, if something occurs, if there is an incident that happens or an event, right? Not only do we deal with, as I said, the actual threat itself. So we investigate it, we've contained it, we blocked the traffic or isolated a host or whatever it might be. We're also working with that client to say, okay, here's the 5 factors that went into this, right? This person's email was compromised. They were able to use, access the VPN using their credentials and so on down the line. So then we can make recommendations like change all these levels people, these people at this level, make them force change their passwords, right? Have better hygiene. Use multi-factor authentication, remove their administrative rights where they don't need it. Like, why does that lawyer need administrative rights to put to deploy a script on a web server? That's ludicrous, right? So you know what I mean? Like, strip those things away so we can provide the kind of, I call them like long-term remediation learning, which improves their posture. And yeah, ultimately, we are the throat that gets choked, because when these things happen, right, we kind of live and die by our ability to defend their fort and, prevent these things from, as I said, metastasizing and becoming, business disrupting. So we're ultimately on the hook, and, we take that responsibility. And, we used to say, and I think it still holds true though, you can sleep at night because we don't.
Using your customers as a form of crowdsourced intelligence seems like a huge advantage, being able to take all that insights and protect all your customers.
Yeah, for sure. And you get, because the sort of the time between identifying a threat or a risk and providing some kind of mitigation strategy is greatly reduced, right? So you don't end up with the suffer in silence kind of problem that we traditionally have, which is, here's this small business, this small manufacturer that got hit by a tailored industry campaign, right? And all the other manufacturers don't even know it happened. So then they all sort of, one at a time fall victim. Whereas we can say, not only for our client base, hey, we just watched a really clever attack where they figured out how to socially engineer and then entrap an executive in a manufacturing firm. So all of our clients, in that category need to be protected. So we do that. We share that information publicly, but then we also we call them kind of like extrapolations, which is, so here's an example. All right. So a law firm got hit because the criminals used a phishing email that had a complaint in it, saying, oh, this client is suing you because of malpractice. And we look at that and go, okay, that's really genius. They stole a court document. It was, at first blush was hard to identify as malicious, right? So we can understand why this person clicked it. And then we go, so if I were to go after doctors, or healthcare, what would I do? Well, I'd come up with a patient malpractice. I'd go find a law firm that practices, malpractice lawsuits. I'd steal one of their public documents. I'd change the names in the PDF, and off we go, right? And what would I do in manufacturing, or what would I do in finance, and so on? So we're always looking at those. And then our threat teams go out. We have a threat response unit, we call it, and they do research, right? So then they're going out trying to find those things, right? And in fact, in one case, they uncovered, not that, but they actually uncovered criminals buying Google AdWords to lure executives to these resource sites. So imagine things like, how much should I pay how much do I pay a developer with X amount of experience? Or what's the template for, employee contracts, and all those kind of basic tools that business people need every day and don't want to reinvent the wheel. So they were literally luring them to a poison site so they could download, whatever it was, Microsoft Office documents that looked like employment contracts. And they were, but, they also carried payloaders, and, they were off to the races deploying malware.
Yeah, that's scary. I've been seeing a lot more malicious activity on Google, which is really scary. Yeah. I think about a week ago there was and I think it's still in the search results. I haven't checked it in the last week, but if you search Venmo login on Google, there was a third place ad that actually led you to a fake site called sites.google with a login to Venmo. I was shocked that this could make it. And it wasn't just one day. It was more than 3 days, I think, sitting there.
Yeah. I can't speak for Google, but I have to assume the just by its namesake, right? The immense volumes of information that are going, through their organization that, they're probably going to catch these. But, it's tough. And of course, every few months they put out new updates on how their search model works, right? When they figure out how somebody's gamed it, they shift again so that, that reduces the kind of the artificial results you're getting. But, there's certainly a time in there where criminals can play. And it shows, I think this is like these, the hits like you talked about, like with Kaseya, for example, or SolarWinds or Microsoft Exchange or whatever it is. They're kind of going after these core utilities in our work life and our IT work life. And that, these aren't things we can turn off, right? Like, okay, fine. Don't use Google. We'll pick another search engine, but they're going to be plagued with the same problem, right? Or, you don't like Microsoft Exchange for email. We'll pick another email service, but they too are being attacked, right? So it's, this is down to, it's your heating, it's your water, and it's your electricity. You can't turn those off if you want to make it through a winter. So, what are you going to do, right? I think I think these criminals are sort of figuring out that, don't poison the wells in the little towns. Let's go poison the well up on the mountain that feeds the entire city, right? Or the entire region. And we've all got our work cut out for us on that respect.
Yeah, I've been hearing about the frailty of the water supply systems in the news, but enough gloom and doom. What does MDR actually cover for those that want to kind of go deeper into the weeds on the topic? Yep. You laid it out into 7 categories, so maybe we'll just run through those fairly quickly, high level. You talk about number 1, SOC Managed SIM. Can you start with that and we'll run through the 7?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you just prompt me along here to make sure I keep honest. So SOC as a service and managed SIM, these are to some degree, I'd almost call them run what you brung. So that type of MDR provider, you've put in whatever it is, your firewall, your endpoints, your cloud services, whatever you've got, and they aggregate it using whatever tools they have. So I would assume it would be 2 things. So like they manage a SIM, right? So they've got a logging system. And in some cases, they'll also have a SOAR, right? A security orchestration and automation tool. So that allows them to pull that telemetry in, analyze it, and take whatever responsive action. So effectively, it's a bolt-on SOC, right? Again, it relies on whatever security you brought. I think the real advantage there is that, of course, you get I think you fully utilize whatever investment you put into those tools. The downside is if you're lacking in certain pieces, like maybe you have network and endpoint, but you don't have cloud, then there's real blind spots there, right? So, but otherwise, it's a very economical and I think effective model.
And the second is called ED Little, single telemetry. What does that mean? Yeah,
so I've talked about these different sources, right? Like endpoint and cloud and network and IoT, and so on. And so there are a lot of EDR endpoint players as an example, or companies that bolt onto that. So they will, sell you CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or whatever it might be. And we do, by the way, just to be, transparent. And then they'll monitor it and manage it for you, right? So again, these are single points of telemetry. So whether it's your cloud only service, it's endpoint only, they do a good job. But the question then becomes not only they've only got, one band of the spectrum, right? Your environment. But then the other piece is, how can they, I call it little r because, it's the depth of your capability to respond, right? To me, respond is I've investigated it, I've contained it and stopped it from happening, and I'm helping you with remediation. Whereas, some companies would argue that R is, I found something suspicious and I sent you an email alerting you. And I don't equate alerts to response.
And number 3, what's the difference between MD Little, multiple telemetry?
Yeah, so same notion here. So now you've got more signals from more than one source. So maybe you've got endpoint, cloud, and your network, right? So they're looking at like an IDS, IPS, or a next-gen firewall. You've got an EDR service in place, like I said, a CrowdStrike or a Carbon Black. The little r piece is that they do good work detecting, but they don't have a lot of strength in the response. So, again, perhaps they can alert, perhaps they aggregate some of that info and they say, look, this looks like we see suspicious activity, but we can't actually block it because we don't have access to the system to block it. Like, for example, let's say they're coming through your VPN your remote administrative tools. They can't do anything about that. So, they're going to contact you and say, look, this is happening, but, here you go, right? We see a threat here. You need to investigate it to validate and verify that threat, and then, take action on your own to figure out how to stop that bad guy.
Number 5, ED big R, single telemetry.
Yeah, same idea. So here again, it's like if you think about detection and response, the D and the R, here they're focused on endpoint only, but they've got very robust capabilities to be able to stop the threats when they detect them with MDR. And so that's, like you said, you can almost put little d. Little d would be single telemetry, I'd say. Big D is going to be multiple telemetry. Little r is I can detect something, but I can't do anything about it. And big R is, I can detect it and I can take action on your behalf to disrupt that attack.
And then 6 and 7, so 6 is, again, talking about MD big R, multiple telemetry, and 7.
Yeah, same idea, right? So this is, I'm it's like picking all the quadrants, I guess, squares and the quadrants kind of thing. And in those cases, too, there's kind of 2 dimensions, right? There's obviously the signals. So how much, imagine that as how much light, can I take in? I open the aperture wider and wider. How much light can I take in? But then the second piece of it's fidelity, right? So, what kind of resolution do I have here? So how can I string all that information together? Can I aggregate it with threat intelligence feeds? Am I using something to filter out all the false positives as an example? And that's also a challenge because like light, right? You open the aperture, you have a greater exposure, but, that can be overwhelming. So now, how are you able to kind of filter out all the stuff you don't want to just see the signal? And that's really what 6 and 7 are about getting more into the advanced capabilities here where you're almost proactively hunting too, right? So you're starting to go, like my example earlier of we saw this really clever attack on a law firm. What would that look like in a healthcare institution? And now we're going to go out, we're going to see if we can find examples of it. We've set up some alerts internally to look for those kind of behaviors. So if we see something like that, and then of course working with the target and I'd call them the accomplices, the non-compliant accomplices like the search engines or the vendor or whoever it might be who unfortunately here is being played and doesn't understand that they're driving the getaway car, right? They didn't know their buddy who just jumped in the car just robbed the bank. Helping them identify that this is happening. And of course then, from a community perspective, we can all protect ourselves and sort of stop these threats or reduce the number of threats at the various levels within the entire internet ecosystem.
Well, thanks for breaking that down for us. So still on this topic of what is MDR, you wrote an article, I think, saying not all MDRs are equal. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So that was really in response to, frankly, the growth or the number of organizations represented in the MDR reports. And it's not about, not having competition or something. It's more about sort of saying, look, you need to understand, as I said, right kind of at the beginning, is because MDR is not a tightly defined service, right? It's very broadly defined. There are lots of different ways of going about it. There's lots of, different sources of, as I said, of signals and telemetry they can pull into, potentially detect threats. There's lots of depth to the capabilities they have of investigating and containing them. And so, that was my point, is to say just because they call themselves MDR or just because they are MDR, there's lots of different flavors, right? I guess it's sort of like cars or automobiles, right? By definition, they're all, were internal combustion engines. Well, now there's electrical alternative energy sources, but they all, effectively have some amount of wheels and drive on generally, roads and whatever, right? We can loosely define what a car is, but there's lots of different things. There's vans, there's Mercedes, there's Honda, there's, there's brands, there's makers, there's different categories of pickup trucks and so on. And so it's a bit like a car. You have to go, well, how far do I drive every day, right? How fuel economic do I need this vehicle to be? What do I have to carry? How many passengers do I require? What's my safety requirements? Maybe I want a much safer car. All those different factors that, any consumer would go about determining what the right purchase is for them. It's the same thing, right? So this is back to, I think, any vendor conversation should be, I am trying to solve this business problem. these are the requirements I have to solve that problem, and then analyze all of the opportunities, the potential solutions you have out there, all those MDR vendors, just to find the best fit. Because I'm not saying that any one is necessarily better than the other, or, that some are certainly not as good. It's more of it's a right fit here, right? So if you've got very strong capabilities in a certain place, like maybe you've got lots of good, detection capabilities and logging, and you just need somebody to troll through that to do more advanced work for you, great. Maybe SOC as a service is perfect. In other cases where, you don't have a lot of technology internally, you don't have a lot of wherewithal, working with an MDR vendor, as you talked about before, takes all that complexity away from you. So if you're in look, I need a SOC, I need you guys to come in and do all this work for me because I just don't have the time, money, and people to do it, that's a different conversation. So you just have to figure out what that looks like for you, and then pick the right, pick the best vendor. And frankly, put them to the test. Right. That's the best way is to, and get referrals. And when you talk to the referrals, get the right, ask the hard questions and the dirty stories, right? Like, did anything ever get in your environment? What happened when it did? That kind of stuff, because I think there's just so much hyperbole out there where companies go, oh, we stop everything, or whatever it is. It's ludicrous, right? So, I think you want the battle-hardened person. You want the person who's been shot at, who's been bloodied, because they're realistic and they know what the combat world looks like, versus somebody who, is sort of, just graduated out of the academy and sort of is, playing war games. And it's a nasty world out there in the sort of the cybercrime element. So you got to get down in the mud.
Yeah, I can relate to so many things that you just said. When you push something, when you disrupt and create a new category, very soon after you have all these Me Too products and everyone jumping on the bandwagon, and you kind of have to shift how you educate and talk to the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And like in my book, right, I talk about stories. And the reason I do that is they're relatable, because I think we're at a point where so many vendors, we're out, we're going through the roof with metrics, right? And, billions of signals or trillions of signals or whatever it is, we stop things in, X amount of time and instead of this amount of time. And, okay, we live in an MBA kind of ruled world where we use metrics to determine performance, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, I want to hear a story like me, right? I want to hear, okay, I'm this type of business, and how did you stop that? Or, you guys say you can stop nation states. So tell me the story, right? I want to understand in detail what happened there. And then when you start to unpack that, that's where you get a confidence level of like, okay, you guys have seen this. Wow, that wasn't great. You had to deal with a lot of, challenges, versus somebody who's coming in going, well, if you buy my magic box, all your problems go away because everything gets stopped. We just know by, I guess inference that can't be true, because there's far too many headlines, of major breaches and massive ransomware based outages that can't correlate to this concept of, perfect security.
And going further into the weeds on this, you talked about testing them. So I guess you could call that a POC. So what questions should potential customers ask when doing a POC, and what should they be evaluating?
Yeah, so if you're testing a company's capability of detecting and responding to something, so I think those questions, I would be breaking this down to what are your greatest risks, right? So we don't want ransomware, we don't want we don't want these kind of attacks. Here's what we're trying to prevent. Asking them, going through the detailed steps of how are you going to stop this? So no check boxes, right? Not do you have a SIM, right? Do you do endpoint? Like that's the beginning of the conversation, but then get down in the weeds. And when you're looking at a POC, for example, there's generally two things that should come up. One of them is the fact that there should be a whole bunch of stuff that they're just not aware of. Do you know what I mean? So suddenly they're like, whoa, look at all this shadow IT, all these apps that we didn't know were in our environment, as an example, or policy violations or whatever it might be, or a whole bunch of malware just sitting around, right? Maybe it's, it's not the malicious kind of stuff. It's a bit more benign, but fine. There's a bunch of stuff in your environment. You realize kind of how dirty it is, that it's not as pristine as you thought. The second thing is, and particularly if you're head to head with somebody, like if you've narrowed this down, they should find the other guy. So we have won multiple POCs in that respect, where another vendor has been in. So, generally because it's an external SOC, there has to be some kind of tunnel, right? Somewhere you are transmitting whatever level of information. And we found them, right? We're like, hey, we found a bunch of connections over here. We're not sure where they go, but they're resident. They're stable. Why is that? Or they keep, they're there, they stop, there's a new one. And if they're not spotting that stuff, because the reality is, I hear this all the time, and this one kind of bothers me, and I get frustrated with ransomware. We have a lot of these big companies get hit, and they go, oh, well, there's no way to stop this, right? The nation state attacked us, sophisticated threats. How am I supposed to, or how's our business supposed to protect ourselves against that kind of existential threat? And, and there was no way of knowing it was going to happen. And, that's not true, right? There are basic things that happen. Phishing campaigns increase. You see compromised credentials. A lot of that stuff is available on the darknet and might actually be detected ahead of time. When they come in, right, there's, aberrant VPN or SD-WAN or whatever it is types of external remote connections. Then they're using remote administrative tools. And you can catch this stuff. You can see things. Like I just dealt with one institution. There was actually a group of companies, and we were actually in final throes with them. Before we started working with them, they got hit by ransomware over a weekend. And the guy, came back to me, and they're talking to us about it. And I literally had this conversation with them. And I said, how many users, were created over the weekend and were promoted to have administrative rights? And he's like, yeah, actually, one of my people caught that, sent me a log file about it. And I kind of did I'll get back to you on Monday, because they didn't think anything of it. So there are little signs, right? It might be a cough, or you just don't have the energy you used to, or food tastes different, or whatever it is, and then you get sick, right? Then you have COVID, or you get the flu or something. It's the same idea. So I'm not saying they don't go completely undetected, but there are often some signs of what's going on in the environment that are the early indicators, and that's where companies got to focus, and that's where you need to ask those MDR players, like, well, how would you detect that? So how do you get through all that stuff, right? How do you look at millions and millions of signals, and how would you determine, for example, the difference between legitimate remote administrative activity and suspicious activity? And once you've done, once you ID it, how would you investigate that and determine whether or not which side of the fence it falls on, and whether or not you need to take action? Because that's where we see most of the threats coming from nowadays.
So would you say a POC is typically more of an audit and understanding the environment versus actually doing a stress test or a real kind of mock attack?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's kind of both, because you're right. There should be some sort of analysis, but stress testing and doing mock attacks is perfectly valid. And I was actually, thank you for cueing me here, because I forgot to say that. When you're doing that kind of work, having them sit in your boardroom on your guest Wi-Fi with a bunch of information about you is not representative. They have to be like the bad guys. They have to figure out how to socially engineer you. You have to give them permission to do it, right? They have to figure out how to try and infiltrate your network and see if you're catching, right? And you're doing it, and see if they catch it. It has to be representative. If you do some kind of, strongman where you already knew which door they were going to try and break through, well, that's not really testing your defenses, right? So, and doing that. And like when we've done these types of proof of concepts, we're running for 30, 60 days. And as I said, first they see a whole bunch of stuff they didn't even know was there, because we just turned on some lights, right, to rooms they never looked. And then the second part, is when these things happen, detect. But the one caveat I'd say about that is make sure you define kind of the rules of the game. And what I mean by that is I've seen this before where companies get lost trying to prove they're clever. So they'll be like, well, you never told me about all these port scans, and you never told me about this. And it's like, no, we didn't. You know why? Because it's all crap and junk. That's the first stage of an attack, and we're waiting for the real stage of the attack. And that's what we stopped here. If you want to know about port scans, have a nice day. Go buy an automated pen testing tool, because it'll do that for you. But there's lots of companies with automated pen test tools that also get hacked and owned. So, this is the point, right? There is a little bit of a defense in depth here. So don't pigeonhole yourself, and don't, you're not trying to outsmart them. You want to create a representative war game. Otherwise, or, red team, blue team, or whatever you're doing as an exercise, because, otherwise, like I said, they may succeed, or actually, I think sometimes worse, they might fail. but you were measuring the wrong things, right? The criteria you used weren't representative. And so you may have, unfortunately, excluded a very valid vendor, right, who could have helped you. And now you've got one that, as I said, they picked up a whole bunch of white noise. And you think because they found 1,000 support scans, they're way better. That other company found, 2 or 3 violations using remote administrative tools. And that's the stuff that will ultimately blow up in your business.
Yeah, make sure you don't go after vanity metrics for sure.
Absolutely.
So I know we're coming up on the hour. Is there anything you would like to add that you think we missed as we wrap up this episode?
It was a very comprehensive talk, actually. And, I think that the short thing here, the one point to walk away with is, regardless of your business, you are a target. Someone is coming after you, regardless of your size, number of employees, your revenue, where you're based. And MDR is a good solution for small, medium-sized businesses that extrapolates away the complexity, that effectively they're going to manage those threats for you. But always, let the buyer be aware, right? Do your homework before you make the purchase, just like anything else, because you want to make sure that you find a complementary vendor who fills the gaps that are the most important to you, right? And that should all be aligned to your business. Whatever the top priorities are, the top risks that you have, those are the ones you want to mitigate, and you want to find the right partner to do that with you.
Thanks so much, Mark. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope our listeners did too. If anyone would like to follow up with you, get in touch, what is the best way?
Yeah, visit eSentire.com. You can contact me through email. It's mark.sangster@eSentire.com. And I'd be happy to provide more information, pass our threat intelligence reports on, any public information that we have. I'd be very pleased to share.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And thanks everybody for taking the time to join us on Cybersecurity Heroes.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.